All right, we're taxiing. In a moment, we'll have liftoff. I'm Todd Gitlin. I teach here communications, sociology, communications. I want to open up. I'm here more as a student than as a moderator because this is not my turf, but I'm eager to learn. I do want to make a couple of quick observations joining the end of the last session. One is that every new technology of which I'm aware has been presented by either its inventors or its publicists or both as the beginning of a brand new world, a world of expanded human powers, a world of enhanced values of one sort or another. All such prognostications are half true and equally half false. And what we've been through in a kind of whirlwind way in the last 20 years with computer-based web projects is in the same ballpark. It's in the same domain. The questions we ask are profound questions, but they're not profound questions because we're starting from scratch. We're always starting on a platform of existing economic structures, political structures, cultural expectations. Nothing is new under the sun. The second thing I want to say, another thing that's not new under the sun, is that new technologies are weaponized. Sometimes they begin in weaponized form. So the very early experiments in radio, for example, the UK and the US government were involved in making sure that radio would be used to suit their respective national security principles. And that takes us to the subject of this panel, which is cybersecurity. So with no further ado, what I'm going to do is just very quickly name our panelists. I will give you the most reduced possible blurb to introduce them, and then they're off and running. Liina Areng is the head of international relations for the Estonian Information Systems Authority, and she's held top positions with the Estonian Ministry of Defense as a cybersecurity advisor and with NATO. And she's going to talk primarily about cybersecurity in action. Robert Jervis, to my immediate left, is the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Politics in the Department of Political Science here, past president of the Political Science Association, and the author of many books, including one whose title seemed apropos, Perception and Misperception in International Politics. Matthew Waxman is the Liviu Lubrescu Professor of Law at Columbia. He served in the National Security Council and then in the Department of Defense and the Department of State. In the Bush administration, he worked unsuccessfully to have US captives treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. And Michael Waller is vice president of the Center for Security Policy in Washington after years as the Annenberg Professor of International Communication at the Institute of World Politics. And I have to add that his doctoral dissertations, which I'm sure I must read now, predicted the former KGB takeover of Russia's economy and government. Has that been published as a book? Good. Okay, so we're off and running. Liina, you're on first.
Hi. I'm extremely thrilled to be here. Following these most interesting discussions today and yesterday. And it's also kind of interesting to be as an outsider, a little bit as an outsider here, as an European and Estonian. When I think of it, what I've heard today and yesterday, then you have to go outside of Estonia in order to appreciate the things that are dear to you back home. And when I've heard the conversations here, I understand that many things are different here, in fact, and we don't have many of the challenges and problems that you face here. The challenges back home are different. That are caused by our geographic location, our resources, or rather the lack of it. And so I'm just, to start, I'm trying to reflect of some of the things that struck me during the presentations here today and yesterday, and kind of give you a comparison of what happens in Estonia in that respect. So first, elections. It was mentioned yesterday that it's very important to make the elections simpler here, easier for people to understand and participate, to ensure political accountability. In Estonia, elections are very, very easy. So for example, if we had elections today, I could just take out my laptop computer and my digital ID card and elect. So all you need is internet, your laptop computer, and your ID card, which has a chip, so it enables you to authenticate yourself and to give a digital signature to cast your vote. Then surveillance and transparency. It was mentioned that although it's, of course, very important, it would never happen here in America because, and transparency as a word is used when you have nothing else to say. So in Estonia, transparency is essential, and I think we take it for granted that we as citizens are the real owners of the data. So transparency is very easy in Estonia. You just have to log onto a citizen portal using, again, your ID card to get a complete transaction log of all the requests of data that different public or private organizations have made against your data. So you can see requests from police, from hospitals, from banks, and if you see any discrepancies there, you can file a request to turn to this agency and ask for more information. And if you don't see that this is justified, you can go to court. So this is very, very transparent. Data has been also discussed a lot, and the monopoly of multinationals over your data. What European Union recently adopted was a regulation concerning the free movement of non-personal data across borders, which means that it eliminates the data localization restrictions and also gives the chance for SMEs and startups to scale up and to enter new markets across European borders. And that also eventually helps the creation of innovative data services and research based on big data. So since the topic of the panel is really conflicts, I have to speak also about the downsides of that digital Narnia where I come from. And the downside is really the dependency that we have in Estonia of all the services that we lead a really digital way of life that makes us vulnerable. And how information systems break? They break in two ways. Either there's a technological failure, or people lose trust in using them. So trust is extremely important, and in Estonia, how we generate this trust is by security by design principle. That the agency where I come from We run and we develop and manage the core components of our digital government infrastructure. And we also operate as a cybersecurity agency. So we have the system designers and system defenders under the same organizational roof. And that, of course, creates a lot of friction because those who care about functionality don't really care about security and vice versa. But we think that's a good model, and we should really sustain that. So to summarize, are we more secure today in Estonia than in 2007, 12 years ago, when we experienced large-scale, politically motivated cyber attacks against our public and private networks, media channels, banks, political parties. As a patriotic Estonian, I should probably say that yes, we are, but since this is an academic setting, and I don't know how many hackers do we have in the audience who would wish harm, I'm more inclined to say that I don't know, really. I'm not sure if we are more secure today than 10 years ago, 12 years ago. Because having my own experience now over 10 years operating in this cybersecurity business and reading the news every day, we see that the attacks are getting more sophisticated. They're getting more strategic in nature, more geopolitical in nature. We have seen attacks against critical information infrastructure, our democratic institutions. So this is really, really scary stuff that is happening out there. What you can do, of course, is you can filter the range of attackers by making the attack more expansive. So basically, you can eliminate the attackers that don't have so much resources. But to be honest, if you are dealing with opponent who has a good motivation and large resources, not to say unlimited resources, they are quite probably able to get in, and then you have to deal with consequences. So what can we do? We can focus on preparedness and resilience and recovery. What is difficult for the attacker is to create persistent results. You can take down a power grid, but depending how much you have invested in business continuity planning and etc., you can get it up again and continue your normal operation. So it's very important to focus on preparedness and recovery. So cybersecurity is not inherently about technology, but collaboration. And this is what we are investing quite a lot in Estonia, on collaboration and community building. Using the voluntary force or people who would like to volunteer their free time to do something good for the government. So we have an organization called Cyber Defense League, which is a unit that operates under our National Guard, and that comprises of IT people from both public and private sectors that come together to exchange information and to practice or to train. And if there is a large-scale cyber attack happening, we can use this resource in order to fend off the attacks. And this has proven an effective resource for us. So on that note of collaboration and importance, I conclude my short expose and happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Professor Jervis. You're on.
Is it on? Oops. My skill. Aha, It's my skill with technology. Well, my comments will follow very nicely the previous one. Let me just start with where you left off, that this is a very complex area. A number of years ago, I was talking to one of the high government, US government officials working on this, and he said, this stuff makes my brain hurt. There are layers and layers of complexity here, partly because the mix of technology and, if you will, human factors is very intricate. It's exactly the trade-off between usability and security. The hack on the DNC never would have happened had the people been using appropriate prophylactic methods, but they were we all know, expensive, time-consuming, they get in the way, and they didn't use them. So this complicates our lives and also complicates our analysis of the situation because it changes quite rapidly, both as the technology change and as we adapt to it. I come to this from having worked during the Cold War extensively on nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy. And you really, for almost all the questions, you didn't have to know any physics. You just had to know these things went boom and killed a lot of people and destroyed a lot of things. You don't have to know an atom from a schmatom. All you have to know is the basic destruction. This is not true in cyber, that a lot of the technical details matter and they change. Let me just give one example. We used to say, recently I think Matt knows this better than I, maybe 4 years ago, that deterrence was very difficult because the attribution problem was more. You couldn't tell who attacked you. My understanding from the experts, I have to take their word for it, is that certainly the US government, the major players, can now do attribution pretty well. Now, they may not be able to do it immediately, and they may not be able to go public with how they know what they know. But the attribution, if you read anything, say, written 4 years ago, they'll start with the attribution problem. Nope, got to start with a different starting place. You get those and many other rapid changes here that make this difficult. It's often said that, and this is related, that we're facing dangers of cyber Pearl Harbor. Even Leon Panetta, I guess as Secretary of Defense, I think said that. I think this is greatly, greatly exaggerated. And again, let me go back to the point you made on the power grid is exactly what I hear from people who know much more, that taking it down is one thing, bad enough, but taking it down over a long, and keeping it down is much, much, much harder. The idea that suddenly we're going to wake up and find that we've been paralyzed by a cyber attack, really very unlikely. By the way, as an aside, also Pearl Harbor, if those of you World War II buffs know, was a disaster for the Japanese because they unified the United States in a way that nothing else could have. They missed the most important 2 targets, the carriers that were at sea, and even more important, the aviation fuel that was stored near the base that would have paralyzed. And they put American battleships, which were reaching their sell-by date anyway, underwater for a year, but they were pretty much, most of them just pumped the water out. In 2 years, they were sailing again. So Pearl Harbor was a disaster, but not for the US. But the analogy just gets you thinking in the wrong way. This does not mean that everything is fine. I'd start with, again, a point you made when you said you don't know whether Estonia is now safer than it was 12 years ago, and you know an enormous amount about that. That's a strike. I think that's, certainly people I know, I think, would say the same thing about the US, and it's very odd. And it just shows the layers of complexity here that we're not sure how these systems respond under attack. We're not sure the capabilities of the attackers. We're not sure of the extent to which our own systems are penetrated. We don't know how resilient it would be. There is just an enormous amount of uncertainty. And, that's both good news and bad news. But again, that's a different world than we're used to thinking about. And it makes people very uncomfortable and perhaps should. There are a number of things about the cyber world, I think, that I find dangerous and potentially destabilizing. The first is that for most cyber tools, this is again in international conflict, it's very hard to distinguish offensive measures or potentially offensive measures from what's normally seen as legitimate and often defensive, which is espionage, spying. Countries spy on each other, time immemorial. You find it in the Bible. You also find, if you know your Old Testament, that the spies that Moses sent came back with totally fallacious information, so very little changes. So cyber is now extraordinarily important in American, and I'm sure every country's intelligence. You try not only to intercept messages and decode them, you try to sort of get in the other side's net, sit on his network, and get the information, extract it, the way the Russians did with the DNC and Hillary's emails. And countries are doing this on the industrial scale. That's considered unpleasant, but legitimate and in some way defensive because you're partly protecting yourself. The trouble is when you penetrate the other side's nets to get information, you also are in a position to disrupt and destroy. The only difference between espionage and disruptive attack is what's at the payoff, the package at the end. And you as a defender can't know that until it's too late. So offense and defense are very hard to distinguish here. And that can easily lead to spirals of escalation and outcomes that no one wants. A second troublesome aspect is that leaders are even less experienced than I am about dealing with cyber things. I grant I couldn't turn on the microphone, but most of our leaders can't even turn on, their computers. That if we get in I don't know what happened in Estonia, which is interesting, of course, but I think if we get a cyber attack in the US, even if we had more qualified leaders, and I think we do now, they wouldn't know what was happening. The people who understand it at a technical and political level would have to convey an enormous amount of information that's difficult to get your brain around to people who've probably sat through 3 PowerPoint presentations and not paid attention. I'd be interested to know, since Estonia's been attacked, if your leaders stay awake in the presentations and can understand them. Because most of the briefers are used to talking to people who understand it. And when I hear them, I have to stop them every 2 minutes. What's that acronym? What is that? The gap between the people who know and the leaders is enormous, and that will be a problem. Also, if there's a crisis, the leaders will be functioning perhaps with degraded communication systems or communication systems they can't quite trust. I'm seeing something on my computer screen, but is it really what I'm getting from the Pentagon, or is it what the Russians have hacked into? This is what we, again, not used to that. Another problem, and I'll stop, is that the role of third parties is much greater than in normal conflict. It's third part in the U.S. at least, and I assume in all the West European countries, the bulk of the targets of cyber attacks are not the government, although it's got plenty, but it's the banks, large companies, you know, that they're on the front lines. And the attackers often are hacktivists, that is, they're people who have political motives, but they're not government officials, or they may just be pure criminals, or they may be criminals hired by governments. And when you get an attack, in many cases, you know, who attribution in this sense, not in the sense of where are the computers that started this, but who is it and what are the motives are difficult. And also, the companies under attack, and they're under attack, are really teched up, and there's great temptation to go hack back. That is, to take offensive actions to try to disrupt or destroy the computers that are attacking them. That is illegal in the US and in other countries? Most countries. And the banks swear in public that they're not doing this. Are they doing it? Matt knows but can't tell us. But in any event, if they're not, my guess is they will. So that's another layer of complexity. Final one is the recent change in the American policy ratified by Cyber Command and the Trump administration, which, make a long story, which I don't fully understand, very short, is a much more assertive, and they say it's assertive, that is, much more trying to meet attacks forward, that is, in third-party computers. And the Trump administration, the Obama administration, highly centralized, I say highly centralized, everything, highly centralized decisions on use of cyber tools. And the Trump administration has delegated that much further down. There are things to be said for this, but obviously it raises the danger that people 3-4 levels down in the chain of command will do things without understanding the full implications, without understanding the ramifications, without understanding the political context, without informing fully the top people, and the chances for undesired escalation coming out of that are quite large.
Thank you. Michael Waller? Well, I was going alphabetical. That's an important constraint. Please.
Great. Thank you, and thanks for deferring. I apologize that I have to leave right at 3:30, which means I get to say some things, but you don't get to ask me any questions. But maybe I'll be extra provocative. But I want to talk about international law, international rules for cyber conflict. Are there any? Will there be any? And I come at this. So I teach international law. I study international law, and in particular, law and armed conflict, law and military conflict. I'm especially interested in how new technologies affect law, and so I think about futuristic things, cyber conflict, the deployment of AI-enabled autonomous weapon systems and things like that. But I take a long historical view too, so I'm also interested in things like 16th century siege warfare and the rules that governed it, if anybody ever wants to talk about that. So I find that conversations about law and cyberspace generally, but especially law and conflict in cyberspace are often describe the situation as a sort of lawless kind of Wild West. And the remedy for that situation that's often proposed or sort of thrown out there is, well, so we need a global treaty. We need rules. So states ought to get together and figure out what the rules are, like a Geneva Convention for cyberspace. And I want to say I think neither that initial description of the Wild West is accurate, nor, though, is the proposed remedy of a global treaty realistic, at least not for the foreseeable future. First, let me talk about why is there no global cyber treaty, right? We have treaties, lots of treaties governing conflict, land warfare, for example. We have global treaties for maritime law of the sea. First of all, it's important to keep in mind those treaties developed law in those areas developed over the course of centuries, and it was finally in the 20th century that they were codified. We're talking often about very long processes of the development of international law. But I think there are three specific reasons why developing a treaty to govern conduct, especially conduct in conflict in cyberspace, will be very, very difficult. One is because the interests of states are just not very aligned on these issues. There are certain questions on which states can agree, but there are a lot of issues on which states don't agree because they have different levels of power, different methods of conflict, different capabilities, different ways in which they use cyber technologies domestically as part of their own domestic governance or with regard to their own domestic polity. Not only are states' interests not aligned, but states don't even quite know what their interests are in this area. I mean, I think if you were to ask and really push the U.S. government officials on what would you want in a cybersecurity treaty, it would be very difficult to pin the U.S. government down. You'd get different answers in different agencies. Sort of putting it most simply, parts of the government want very permissive rules because they want to go out and be able to do a lot of stuff against other states or non-state actors in cyberspace. And other parts of the government are very interested in defense and maybe interested in very restrictive rules. So interests are not very well aligned. Second factor making development of international law, especially negotiation of a treaty in this area, difficult is the low visibility of actions and reactions in cyberspace. Bob talked about some of these. Even if activities are detectable by intelligence communities, intelligence agencies, they're often not very publicly visible. So monitoring and enforcing compliance with treaties is likely to be extremely difficult in this area. And finally, a point I alluded to earlier, Bob mentioned complexity of cyber issues. It's complexity combined with speed, the development of newer and newer technologies and therefore newer and newer methods of conflict. One thing about law, international law generally, is it tends to move slowly. Technology, on the other hand, tends to move quickly, and the pace of that change is even accelerating. So there's sort of a general challenge in the area of cyber law of getting both international and domestic, of can law keep up with changes in technology? So those are reasons to be pessimistic about the prospects of a global treaty. But let me give some reasons for some optimism that there are and will be greater development and clarification of international rules and international norms in this area. One is there's a lot of global conversations going on. A lot of them are not reaching consensus, but there is a lot of diplomatic effort among states devoted to trying to negotiate, clarify, develop rules in this area. Increasingly, the private sector, civil society and the private sector is sort of inserting itself into those negotiations and the development and perhaps in some productive ways. I mean, I think one interesting phenomenon in this area is that because so much of the digital infrastructure globally is controlled by private hands rather than states, which hold a monopoly on a lot of the instruments of kinetic violence. Private industry may play a much greater role in setting some global rules for conflict in cyberspace than it does for other areas of conflict, or at least I want to pose that as a question to think about and consider that I think is quite interesting. There's a lot of action among states trying to interpret existing international law. Existing laws of war, existing application of the UN Charter and rules of self-defense, or rules about state sovereignty, and how do long-standing rules apply to new technologies. Some of the new applications and contexts are new, but many of the legal concepts are long-standing. So overall, I'd say I'm more optimistic about the development of international law in this area, international norms for cyber conflict, than those who say that there are no rules yet even, that it's a Wild West situation. I think there's a lot more going on and a lot more content to global governance of cyber conflict. But I don't expect the outcome of these negotiations to look like rules for other forms of conflict. I don't expect it to look like a Geneva Convention for cyber conflict, or the UN Convention on the use of cyber weapons as a model for what international rulemaking will look like. But thank you. And again, I apologize that I have to rush off.
Godspeed. Michael Walsh.
Thank you. The internet was created as a weapon and only later adapted for civilian purposes. There's a historic marker in Arlington, Virginia, one of the sort of George Washington slept here type cast iron markers, marking the invention of the internet by a Pentagon agency, or what became the internet. So when we think about it as a civilian product first, we really have to think it was designed as a weapon. So the core root servers of the internet to this day run through the Pentagon. The problem is, how do we manage that as civilians and then when you have civilian companies and you have non-state actors using those same systems and same root servers, whether it's Facebook and Twitter or a terrorist organization, all using the Pentagon's root servers to communicate and to commit whatever acts, good or bad, that they might do. How do we manage that? And then as a society, how do we manage defending that and waging conflict through that? And added to that is the traditional military chains of command are by nature very slow and deliberative. The political chains of command over the military are generally very slow. The diplomatic system is usually very slow and deliberative. So all the bureaucratic process, and then things need legal review, which is often extremely slow. And even running covert operations through the intelligence services by nature is very slow, because each covert action needs the president physically to sign off on it in what's called a finding. So you have these very slow and cumbersome pre-digital decision and command systems that we have, and then the rapidity of how cyberspace really works, and how then non-state actors work, and then how any of us potentially can start or participate in a world conflict if we choose to. So it's a really powerful thing when you think about it. Then you think of the legality of that, the morality of that, the ethics of that. But if you think, like it or not, whichever side you might come down on, the Arab Spring was definitely a cyber-driven conflict. The Iranian Green Revolution attempt in 2009 previously was a very much cyber-driven conflict, driven around the world by Iranian expats and their supporters to support the people inside Iran against the regime. Subsequent attempts were as well. The current situation in Venezuela, largely a cyber-driven conflict where you have a hybridized version of private initiatives on the Venezuelan side private initiatives of a single U.S. senator who happens to speak fluent Spanish and chairs the Western Hemisphere subcommittee, whose state, Florida, has a lot of interest in all things Latin American. And then certain people in the State Department and throughout the government, all supporting a very broad-based coalition of Venezuelans, getting a lot of bipartisan support, and then getting some of the most broad possible international support in a very rapid fashion. That did not take place through our traditional embassies and using those systems. It took place mainly through Twitter. If you look at how these various governments around the world started recognizing the Guaido interim government of Venezuela, that was mainly done through Twitter. So you're finding now the whole diplomatic process in that case was sidestepped. The Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau of the State Department was sidestepped in favor of a former government official, Elliot Abrams, who was brought in to supervise this through the National Security Council, bypassing the whole State Department bureaucracy. What does that say about embassies and how they work? What does it say about state actors in general if this is an internationalist movement that's supporting a government because, according to its constitution, the parliamentary speaker can proclaim himself to be president in the event the actual president is abusing office? Very unusual situation, but then you had this crescendo of diplomatic recognition from Donald Trump to Justin Trudeau, really polar opposites politically, and then a big follow-on after that. So it was a very remarkable thing that if you follow it every day, it can be very exciting, but if you think about it more, it can be also very disturbing. One of the disturbing elements of this is how this battle space of cyberspace was used, and it's been brought up a lot during this event, to interfere in our elections. It's a big problem. Even if not all the facts are in, even if some of the facts are not yet examined to their fullest, you have Russian attempts, successful or otherwise, to interfere in our elections. And we get very alarmed at this in the 2016 election, but then you put into perspective, Moscow has interfered in our elections ever since about 1920, when there were Moscow-controlled Communist Party in the United States running candidates. They were funded by Moscow, directed by Moscow, under discipline to support whatever Soviet line was being pushed at that same time. And it only broke up around 1988 or 1992, whenever the party stopped running its candidates. So we've had this over this long time. They're just doing it a different way now. Putin has a different way of doing it. So if we step back and don't become so alarmed at it and say, geez, this is their traditional way of statecraft over the past century, how can we combat that? And we sort of gnash our teeth and wring our hands about, oh, this is happening to us, what are we going to do? You have, well, first you have your investigative capabilities that are very well underway, and you have specifically in Europe counter-disinformation privately and publicly funded entities that are doing a great job in very different perspectives on countering Russian disinformation and propaganda. But we haven't done anything yet to build a retaliatory capability or a deterrence capability. And this is where it's something that it's easy, relatively easy, it's cheap, it's humane, it's non-military, but it can really cause a lot of headaches for those dictators like Putin who want to interfere in our democracies and undermine us. Who's trolled Vladimir Putin? He reads his German and Russian language Twitter accounts. He tweets on his own, if you follow them. His real tweets have his initials on them. So he has a thin skin and a huge ego. What better target to really screw him every time he tries to stick it to us? Especially if you can appreciate his really gross sense of humor, his sense of inferiority, the way he tries to, he wasn't always the alpha male type that he pretends himself to be. People who knew him when he was a teenager said he was a very different type of predator. But he was always a bad guy, but there's so much dirt on him. Imagine a WikiLeaks set up to mine the private information of his inner circle and to make it public on a private sector basis or having intelligence services do it. and spilling it out. Lots of things that can be done. Or only digging up dirt on certain oligarchs who he really depends on, and he can't rule without the support of those oligarchs. It's not easy to know who they are. This information is already collected by mainly people in London who are doing this, so it's available in Russian and in English, but it's not difficult to do. There was a case where Ukrainian hackers got into the email accounts of one of Putin's right-hand people and published those online. It was terribly embarrassing. And this was right at the time the Russians invaded Ukraine. The same group of hackers took down the power grid in Crimea, and then when it didn't stay down long enough, they went in and blew it up. They hacked into the Russian command and control and issued false orders for the invading forces to confuse the troops and confuse the tank movements and everything else. And this was just a group of less than 10 people with no budget, without the authority of their own government, because their own government was too corrupt to really defend their country against the invaders. So this is a case of citizens' self-defense of their own country, and they were doing it in connection with the militia groups that they'd set up to defend eastern Ukraine against the invaders. So this whole area of cyberspace and conflict is flipping the way we do traditional statecraft on its head. It takes longer to write an academic paper on certain things than it does to change the ways of doing things. And so the opportunity is here for anyone who wants to engage in conflict or defend against conflict or deter against conflict or retaliate against conflict without escalating it up the military scale. But it's also going to change the way we do intelligence, covert operations, and it's also going to change the way we do diplomacy when we find the increasing obsolescence of traditional embassies and traditional diplomatic processes. So this is a huge battle space that we've just begun to explore.
Thank you very much. We are almost out of time. If anyone on the panel would like to respond, you have that opportunity. Would any of you? We can handle one simple question. Do we have a mic for?
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. I'm a reporter on fintech and blockchain and crypto. Every time I read something about the Estonian government using blockchain technology to build up the cybersecurity system, I'm always very exciting. So here, my question is, what do you think the blockchain can be further, used and developed for Estonian government? And what could be the useful lessons offered to NATO allies to better use this technology? Thank you.
Well, blockchain is I think it's a future technology that will be increasingly used to protect critical infrastructure and different information systems. We have used blockchain since 2012. We started testing it in 2008. And I guess we are one of the first use cases where we use that in government, this distributed ledger. And it has, it's obviously an effective method, we have exported that also to the States. The Department of Defense is using that, and Lockheed Martin. So it's spreading, and so that's like I guess a quality stamp that it's a technology to stay. I don't know whether that will survive the quantum surprise that we are all waiting to to see, how and when do we have to move our critical assets to another technology that would survive that. The quantum technology, but blockchain could be one of the solutions so far. Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I know it's been a long day and a long day and a half for those of you who've been here for the whole thing. We now have a dose of human caffeine to end the day. And we'll leave you on a happy note and singing a song as you leave the room after all the stuff we've been talking about for the last couple of days. This is something that we did at the conference last year, and it was really a great success, and we're going to replicate it here with Columbia students. Anyway, thank you all for being here, and now we need to repossess the chairs. You hear me? And in fact, we need to repossess the one other chair over there. This is the one time we're going to have an extra person up here. Anyway, thanks, Michael. I need your chair. That's not really mine. It's Columbia's. Yeah, I think I got it. Yeah. All right. Don't go away, folks. We're going to get started right away. No.
Oh, okay.
I sure hope not. Yeah, go, yeah. Go get people and tell them to come back in.